but which is something that I think we're all going to be hearing a lot more about in the coming years. So this is the place for you to learn about it. My name's Polly Curtis. I'm the Chief Executive of the think tank Demos. Demos exists to work on ways to upgrade democracy, to mend what we're really seeing in this country, which is the fracturing relationships between state and citizen, and how people learn about the information supply chains that fuel that democracy are at the heart of what this work Demos is leading is about. We've got the most fantastic panel here today, a brilliant, and we're rivaling the Chancellor, so we're very grateful for you for being here. And I know, just looking around the room, there is some brilliant expertise in the audience as well, so I'm really keen to come to questions at the end. But I'm going to start by introducing our panellists. So Shuab Gamot is a researcher who is doing the most fantastic work looking at young people's information environments, and that's what we're going to hear from Shuab on today. Kirsty McNeill is Member of Parliament for Midlothian and Parliamentary Under-Secretary of State for Scotland, and is an inspiration to me and many others on that relational issue in democracy, about how the state relates to citizens. Annalise Dodds is Member of Parliament for Oxford East and cares about this, I know, in an international context as well. And my colleague Hannah Perry is Associate Director with the Demos Digital team, leading our information environment work. And I'm going to start with Hannah because I think we all need a new beginner's start here on what epistemic security is. Hannah.
So, good morning, everyone. So epistemic security is all about securing our knowledge and information, and so treating our knowledge and information society as a precious resource, much like water. And we think it's particularly precious for our democracy. So really recognising how crucial information is to understanding that we are living in a shared reality, deliberate with one another, and facts with one another. We think that with a secure information ecosystem, we have a stronger economy, because there is stability in our financial markets, a healthier society, but also that information is equally distributed. And we have a useful, we think, way of imagining the information ecosystem, because it can be something that's quite ambiguous and sometimes for all of us overwhelming. We break it down into a supply chain. So we think about information production, we think about information distribution, and also information acquisition or evaluation. And if you use that supply chain flow, you can then start to really evaluate the threats and challenges that we face. Really pivotal for our democracy at the moment. So thinking firstly about the digitalisation of our information environment and the centralisation of control of those areas of our information supply chain, recognising that as more and more of us get our news from social media and platforms that are owned by the US or China, we've lost a lot of control over our information supply chain. But also with the collapse of our news ecosystems, recognising the impact of the digitalisation of the distribution of news and information, we're also losing our information production, so the sustainability of information production. And then we look to our regulatory environment. Whilst we have laws such as the Online Safety Act or the Digital Markets Competition and Consumer Act, like good pieces of legislation, they've been slow to come into effect and they will continue to be slow to come into effect. And we also believe that there are gaps in that legislation. And when we think about the threats to our environment, we can be thinking about increased levels of foreign interference, not just from state actors anymore, but also quasi-state actors or platforms themselves, or even thinking about bots, so not even just humans now interfering in our information environment, but also other threats like the increased authoritarianism globally, mistrust in our democratic institutions, and in an environment where we have to make some really difficult policy trade-offs. So just coming back to the importance of the information environment, we believe that we need to be securing our epistemology, our knowledge and information.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. Just to pause there for a moment, any clarifying questions? Did that make sense? Got it. Brilliant. So Shuab is going to put that kind of in the real lived experience of the world and taking us through into the kind of lives of 16-year-olds today, which is the work that Shuab's been doing. So Shuab.
All right, thank you, Polly. Good morning. My name is Shuab. I'm a researcher at the Future Governance Forum. for the past, for 6 months of the past year, been seconded on a national listening project led by Peter Annie. So we had the privilege of talking to 16 to 18-year-olds across the country about identity, populism, and their views on democracy. So we've travelled around the country, we've spoken to 716 to 18-year-olds with the intention of going deeper through the headlines into how this generation actually thinks, what they feel, where they're getting their information, and their hopes and fears for the future. When we started this project, it felt like 16-year-olds in particular were being completely let down. They've been guinea pigs through some of the most formative years of their lives. The COVID lockdowns, the experiment of remote learning, the tidal wave of addictive social media, algorithms, growing up in an age of inescapable populism. When they look to the future and they see housing out of reach, insecure jobs, and climate anxiety, and then on top of all of that, they're patronised, they're called snowflakes. They're told, I'm told, don't buy coffee and you'll be able to afford a house. Written off as authoritarian sympathisers, or as if they don't believe in democracy at all. And too often, the public debate about young people is shaped by these cliches rather than the reality. Wisdom is that Andrew Tate dominates young men's minds. The reality is that he's already fading, and that young people's media diets are far more fragmented than the headlines suggest. The received wisdom is that young people are disengaged in politics. The reality is that they deeply care, but they're tired of being patronised and exhausted by scandals. The received wisdom is that social media is passive. The reality is that young people are politically expressive online, but often feel ignored offline. So, I've got a very tight script here, by the way, and I apologise for this, stick to it. We wanted to get... So we went out big workshops and small workshops across the country, from Sunderland to Bristol. Our report is expansive, but I decided to just pull on one hopeful thread. Because despite everything, despite not being given much reason to, the vast majority of the young people we spoke to told us that they believe in democracy, that it's something worth defending. Most of them believe that their lives would be better than their parents, which honestly shocked me. I don't know if mine. And many told us that they're still proud to be British. But, and this is critical, that optimism is fragile. Britain, they told us, is going in the wrong direction. The vast majority. Young people feel the country isn't working for them, and that their voices aren't being heard in the current political system. And yet, when you listen to them, it's clear that they're not disengaged. Many had strong, incredibly detailed opinions and views of the country's priorities should be. They knew what mattered to them, but felt like no one was listening. Take night time, for example. Obviously a big issue, an issue that I knew was a big issue going in, but it came up again and again in our conversations. In one school, halfway through a session, we took a break, I went outside to get some fresh air, and was met by like watermelon clouds of vaping students. And a couple of the students that weren't talking throughout the session were talking passionately about knife crime, how it should be more of a priority for the country. Peter and I were genuinely surprised, travelling around the country, in middle-class areas, in poor was an issue everywhere we went. What story are we telling young people about about their lives and how we care about their lives and their priorities? The state government, for example, have done some really interesting things on lifetime prevention, but how are we telling that story? The way that I found out about it was on Instagram, the Prime Minister's Instagram page. He was stood outside with Idris Elba. I like Idris Elba. I grew up with Idris Elba just about watching Uther. I'm sure some people grew up watching The Wire. But a 16-year-old, a 15-year-old doesn't know who Idris Elba is. How are we communicating with them? And yeah. So my message is simple. They're not a lost cause. They're brimming with ideas and hope and a belief in democracy that is far stronger than many give them credit for. But that belief is fragile. If we fail to listen and if we don't invest in their spaces, and so we risk losing that hope to a code of cynicism. And the bad faith actors that Hannah mentioned before.
Brilliant. I have so many questions already, and I'm sure our audience members will as well. But that was really powerful, and we're publishing that work at Demos in a few weeks' time, and I'm really excited to share. There's so much rich detail, and I think the point you make about the kind of hopefulness, it really strikes me that young people do think their lives will be better. Like, that's not the narrative we have at the moment, so thank you. I'm going to go to Kirsty next. Can you tell us about how you experience the kind of information dysfunction we're seeing at the moment as a elected politician?
Yes, happily. So, I mean, the first and most important thing to say is just like a huge thank you to Demos. Really important work, and you really kind of hit on something. I think I've got three reflections about my worries in this area that I offer, not as a challenge to this programme of work, but hopefully some perspectives coming at it from the side. My three worries in this area actually all precede the extent to which we lived online. I'm not suggesting for a minute that the amount of time we're spending online haven't exacerbated these challenges, but I think we do precede them. And the three challenges that I have are around polarisation, which was pre-existent, although accelerating, exposure to partial information, and our willingness or otherwise to take personal responsibility for how we access information and live together well in light of what we learn. So to give you an example of what I'm worried about in terms of polarisation from my own experience as a politician, relatively early on, I had to go and open a bridge, right? Which was just a delightful thing to be able to do. It's going to make a huge difference to two communities on either side of the Clyde. And it was funded through the City Region Deal Growth Programme. And for those of you who are familiar with it, the nature of the Deals Programme is a third of the money comes from the UK government, from us, a third comes from the Scottish government, and a third comes from the relevant local authority. The UK government is obviously a Labour government, and the Scottish government is currently controlled by the Scottish National Party, and the relevant local authority in Glasgow is controlled by the Scottish National Party. I went and opened the bridge. It was great. I put up a picture online saying, look at this bonny bridge. Like, it was very, very straightforward. And then I got a litany of people saying, you don't want your effing unionist bridge. Anything, if this piece of infrastructure has a point of view on the Constitution, which I'm not persuaded it does, but if it does, it's at least a 2/3 nationalist bridge. In fact, it's only a 1/3 unionist bridge. But how has the nation of the Enlightenment got to a state where some of our citizens are shouting at our elected representatives about a piece of infrastructure, right? So that to me is revealing and helps illuminate the fact that we had pre-existing quite deep polarisation in bits of our country, and we shouldn't do the work of the divisive actors for them by saying we are irredeemably divided. I don't believe we are, and we're certainly not as divided as the headlines might make you believe. But there are pre-existing forms of polarisation in our society which are exacerbated but not created by the amount of time we spend online. So I think we have to have due attention to what we're going to do about the drivers of polarisation that aren't exclusively to be found in technology. The second thing I'm worried about is a loss of, and there may well be funders in the room, so this is directed primarily at you. There is a huge amount of energy in philanthropy and in politics and in commentary. There's a huge amount of energy about what we're going to do about disinformation and misinformation. There's actually very little energy that I can see around what are we going to do about the presentation that is correct but decontextualised. So actually, one of the things I think that is going on, this is driving tension, is repeat exposure to information that is true but utterly shorn of any context. And that is a particular vulnerability we have if we spend a huge amount of time online. The repeat exposure to one story about a particular form of crime, for example, that is everywhere, and the people that you live amongst are not to be trusted. It's not misinformation or disinformation. It's not that the thing hasn't happened. It's just, it's not very typical of your community or neighbourhood. Now, we're particularly vulnerable to that because we live online, and this information is coming to us often the first thing that we see when we wake up in the morning and the last thing we see before we go to sleep at night, because our phones are by our beds. But that's not a completely new phenomenon, because the repeat exposure to people of here is a piece of benefit fraud, or here's someone who has abused the immigration system, or here's someone who's been allocated social housing but perhaps wasn't eligible for it, that's something that those of us who've grown up reading particular print publications are well used to having to deal with in politics. But I think the fact that we learned that lesson some time ago, that repeat exposure through print to information that's accurate, but shorn of context can be very destabilising in a polity. We knew that before. We need to relearn that lesson that online life makes us particularly vulnerable to that, but it's not new. The third thing that I have as a kind of worry in this area is it is entirely right, and I know some of the questions from the floor are likely to touch on this, it is entirely right and proper that people ask national government what the regulatory and policy and legal response to some of these challenges will be. However, we also all have a role to play in the fact that what we are choosing to do together is live online together in the way that we have lived in communities around campfires together. We have choices about what we reward with our attention, and we have choices about how we're going to spend our time. And I guess the thing I want to leave you with is, because we have choices as individuals, as citizens, as consumers of information and much else, because we have choices, one of the choices I'd invite us to make is to not make the category error of assuming that because these are online problems, they have an exclusively online remedy. So I don't believe that the regulation of our life online is where the primary remedy to these problems is to be found. And I have spent much confidence making what I believe not to be actually quite a big political argument about the remedy to many of our social challenges is to be found in spending more time together in real time and real life. So there is a number of kind of government initiatives that are designed, although not expressly badged as this, but they are actually designed to do that. So the Pride in Place programme that was announced this week is designed to make our neighbourhoods happier, more cohesive, more relational places to be. The Civil Society Covenant that Polly and I helped launch, the Prime Minister's Civil Society Covenant, with its focus on volunteerism and how we help rebuild civil society, is designed to find ways for us to spend time together, changing the places that we love. My own particular focus is on reviving the working men's club movement, the social club movement. I've been doing a lot of work with that, with the Cooperative Party on that. There is a number of different ways into this, but the underlying imperative is the same. That we need to make a choice, in my view. We need to make a choice. It's very urgent now. We need to make a choice about living together well in real time and real life. Now, Polly has heard me say this before because I have been kind of teeing up and trying out this argument in various settings over the last 6 months. I'm quite nervous, honestly, and let me sort of take you into my confidence. I'm quite nervous about being a politician who fronts this for two reasons. I'm not sure what the market is in our modern politics amongst the public and my voters. I'm not sure how much there is a market for politicians saying, you should make different choices in your personal life. I'm going to reach down into your personal life, not with a regulatory tool, or a budget tool, or a legal tool, simply by using the convening power and platform I have as a politician. I'm going to invite you to make different choices. I'm not sure whether that will be well received because it's personal. The second reason I'm not sure that it will be well received is because it's hard work. And those of you who are at a session I did earlier in the week will have heard me say this before, for which apologies. Being in relationship with people is hard work. Anyone who is married knows that to be the case. Right? It is definitely more stressful for me to spend time with my own spouse than it is alone. I'm mad about my spouse. Right? I'm absolutely crazy go nuts for him. But being with other people, even people that you really, really, really like and have chosen to commit to, is hard work. It's incredibly hard work to be with people that you don't know that well. And it's much harder work to be with people that you don't know that well who are different to you in background or perspective. And it's the hardest thing of all to do hard work with people that are not like you and that you don't know that well. So the art of remaking the places that we love with people who are not like us, but with whom we share it, that is a hard work. So I want to be really clear, this isn't a kind of very loosey-goosey, hippie-ish invitation I'm making to you all. I'm making to you all what I think is actually quite a hard-edged offer, which is if we want to find ways to live together well, despite our differences, and accommodate our differences of perspective and background, which to me is the challenge of the 21st century, if we want to do that, we have to decide together that we're up for it. I'm nervous about issuing that invitation because I don't know whether there's a market for it, but maybe in the Q&A you can tell me whether there is.
Brilliant, thank you. So much of what you said connects with the programme we're running. When we first called it Epistemic Security, we proceeded with a conversation about changing the conversation from how do you stop the bad stuff to how do you get more of the good stuff out there when people need it to kind of fuel democracy through relationships. So I relate so much of what you just said. Annalise, can we kind of go international from there? We've gone kind of right down local into kind of the relational part. Kind of in the end, this has a very international domain as well.
Yeah, it does. I mean, I think this is one of the most important conversations that we're having at this conference, actually, because I think in many ways we are in an emergency situation when we look at, frankly, the pollution of the information environment that we're seeing, its fragmentation, the kind of pressures that people are experiencing. We've already heard about this now. I think we are in a very, very difficult context. And if I may, just one quick comment about where the UK is on this in comparison to other nations. And it's really interesting what Kirsty and indeed what the other speakers were saying. I mean, the UK is, on many measures, ideologically polarised. Like, that's the case. You look at polls, you look at people's attitudes towards different things, and you can see that people have different views. Where the UK has differed over recent years from countries like the US is that we're not so-called effectively polarised. So we still think, generally, we could have a chat with someone who's got a different point of view to us in the pub, or, you know, on the bus, or down the playground, generally, right? So we think that more than people who live in the United States. We're not as worried about living next door to somebody who has a very different mindset to us as people in the US. And I think that is significant, but where I suppose I agree with Kirsty, I think this about online and offline, but where I think the balance maybe is starting to change a little bit is that, you know, I often look at this through the kind of lens of the playground. So politicians don't talk about playgrounds very, very rarely. We recently had a debate about playgrounds. It's the first one that I could remember. But playgrounds, I think, are really important places because in playgrounds you have to get on with everybody else, right? You have to teach your kids to get on with everybody else and not to push the other kids off the slide or whatever, hopefully. But you also have to get on with the other parents, at least in theory, right? And if you've got parents in different backgrounds, you've somehow got to get on with them, right? Now, what I have noticed happening recently is what's going on online is affecting what happens in playgrounds. And you've got people receiving abuse in playgrounds. Now, that, I think, suggests that there is, as I say, I think there's a different balance, right? And there's something that we need to be dealing with a certain amount of urgency here. And I think fundamental to this, and I know we may get onto this later, is for us to kind of maybe reject some of the conceptualization of the online world. You know, I think we may get onto later, you know, use of the concept of freedom of speech. Freedom of speech is very important. Freedom to harass and silence, however, is not the same as freedom of speech. Similarly, freedom of choice is very important, but online, people often are not actually exercising their freedom of choice. And I'm sure that people have seen what Nick Clegg has been saying about this. He's slightly changed his tune a little bit recently. But there's that famous quote from him where he said, people like misinformation. Human beings have never, ever been nice. That is just the case. We like sensationalism. Actually, if you ask people what they want from the information environment, what they want from news, they don't say that they want highly emotional content all of the time. They don't say that they want to see the most sensationalist content all of the time. They often say that they want local news and that they want it indeed to be contextualised, right? So this isn't about whether people are choosing necessarily this content. They've been denied that choice, and part of that denial has been part of a political programme. And I think we've got to acknowledge that. We are at Labour Party conference, right? It's part of a political programme where we now see some of the authoritarian right working with some of big tech in relation to that political programme. So, international context. That programme is an internationalised one, okay, to push politics more towards division. So the response has got to be international, I think, as well. We've seen, obviously, a number of measures being taken at EU level, and I've called for a structured dialogue in relation to protecting democracy. There is now something within the UK-EU summit agreement which is focused on particularly foreign interference. I think that's promising. But that has particularly got a focus, as was mentioned, on state actors. I think we need to be looking at non-state actors as well. And we need to make sure that it is effective because we're facing the same threats. We've got the same organisations and businesses that are pushing against what's happening at EU level as are pushing against the UK's online safety architecture now. It's exactly the same. So we need to be learning from each other and acting where we can together because there can be safety in numbers. Again, many EU member states, we look at what France has been doing in this regard. Again, it's received a strong pushback, so has Germany. So indeed, looking further beyond, have Canada and Australia as well. But I suppose just the last thing that I want to say is, as I mentioned, this is a global movement, and I think there are allies actually within the global south too. And I would particularly single out here what's been happening in Brazil. I'm sure there's people in this audience who are aware of this. Clearly there's very, very strong pushback by the Trump government in relation to the current administration in Brazil because the legal action that it's taking against an attempt to coup. But that kind of push started actually previously because of the action that the Brazilian government was taking against disinformation and against really problematic content that was being pushed. And just one final comment that I would make on this, that certainly in Brazil and in a number of other countries, you've had those who are against those attempts to reduce disinformation, saying that somehow they are anti-authoritarian, that they're seeking to protect citizens from government overreach. But of course, we can remember that actually these technologies have been used by governments as well to fuel disinformation. It's not so long ago that Facebook accepted responsibility for the fact that we'd seen disinformation about Rohingya people being pushed by the Myanmar authorities through Facebook. They apologised for that. That was a few years ago. I would ask, would they apologise now? I think that's an interesting question to ask. So that push, that authoritarian push, I believe is global, so resistance to it has got to be global as well. So we've got to work with other nations on this. Thank you.
It's quite good value, isn't it? We're kind of covering a lot of territory and in quite a lot of depth very quickly. I feel like what we've talked about is a lot of the kind of wearing away that our information dysfunction is having on democracy, but there are moments where the kind of emergency escalates, like we saw after the Southport riots and during the riots last summer. Both Ofcom and the Terror Watchdog now say social media definitely was a factor in aggravating and amplifying that. Does the government need to do more to regulate in those moments to protect the public at those times? I wonder if I could go to Kirsty and then Hannah on that.
Yeah, so I think, so just to be absolutely clear, I'm not the relevant minister here, and I don't want to ventriloquise him or speak for him, but I think what the government says is that we did launch a consultation after Southport, and we're still looking through the kind of findings of that then and what the different differentiated responsibilities should be when you're in an emergency situation. And also the Online Safety Act has not had that long to bed in to build an evidence base about what's working and not working, and it's certainly not that we've kind of closed our ears to the evidence that arises. It's just we don't have enough of it yet because it's all so new. But if I could, and I don't want to be Pollyannish about this because I don't believe I am, but I think it's important to hold on to a few things. So the story of the riots is of course a story of kind of really horrifying violence and public disorder, but it's also a story of the clean-up. It's also a story of the collective community response, and something that, and I've done quite a lot of work on misinformation and hate in different organisations that I've been involved with at a governance level and a board level, and that can be very, that's wearing for the soul, right? Like looking the darkness in the face every minute of the day is bad for you. it's bad for us even if you're doing it one step removed as a trustee. I don't know what the researchers who do that day in, day out, or the very brave people that will not hate who do embedded work are contending with kind of spiritually and emotionally and mentally, because as I say, I find it very sort of wearing, even at one step removed. But the thing that kept me going through all of that is in one of Desmond Tutu's many books, he has this kind of great line where he says, like, I'm not one of these people that gets depressed watching the news. I actually love watching the news. And the reason I love watching the news is because the bad things are on the news because they're unusual. So even when I see stories about a murder or great cruelty or violence that we can visit upon each other, we are very obviously capable of that as a species. It's on the news because that doesn't happen very often. It is comment-worthy and unusual because actually the underlying story of our species is billions and billions of us live in unbelievable proximity under resource pressure and with resource competition. We live in societies where we rub along with strangers and don't hurt them, and they don't hurt us. That's actually the underlying story of our species. So it's really important, and we shouldn't, we shouldn't shy away from the seriousness of what happened last summer, but nor should we turn our eyes away from the depth and the humanity involved in the collective response. And if I could just underscore why it's important to remind ourselves of the behaviour we engaged in, and this is why I'm so obsessed with how to get people into clubs and spending time with each other and living together well in real life, is like the great insight of cognitive behavioural therapy, and therefore one of the great insights we should apply to public policy, is thoughts follow behaviour, not the other way around. So if you can get people working together well, whether it's to clean up after a riot or whether it's to transform a local park, if people work together despite their differences, their thoughts will change. You can't reach into the sort of soul of a person and change what they think if you can't first change what they're exposed to and who they interact with. And that's true of all of us, so I'm not pathologising other people. I need this as much as anyone. Like, I need repeat exposure to people who challenge me because that's how I learn and think. So I don't want to be complacent and suggest that there's no further room for regulatory action. There may well be if evidence points to that, but we also have to talk about all these other things about how we live together well that aren't rooted in policy, they're rooted in the decisions that we're making, each of us, each day.
Fantastic, thank you. Hannah?
Yeah, I totally agree with that. I think I'm going to do a both and pivot us back to tech platforms and thinking a bit more about regulation, which I totally accept. We're in a really delicate situation at the moment because I think there are strong accusations of overreach around freedom of speech and freedom of expression, and getting the balance right when you're thinking about regulating tech platforms, particularly in moments of crisis, the ones that are particularly acute and febrile for those sorts of accusations. But I think when we look back to incidents like what occurred with Southport, I think what we saw there was indeed that the Online Safety Act hadn't yet come into force. So we know that was why a whole range of illegal content wasn't being removed fast enough. But when we now look at the Online Safety Act being in force, I think our concerns as a team at the moment are that it still wouldn't prevent the kinds of graphic content or the kinds of behaviour that we were seeing on platforms. And the reason for that is it's not just because of the information vacuum that was playing out in the way that the police response occurred initially, but it was also because what we're seeing across platforms, particularly certain ones where they are cutting back on trust and safety teams, they are favouring methods of moderation which move away from funding fact-checking and human moderation and more towards AI-based moderation and community-based methods. And what we saw during the Southport riots, and this is something that we actually conducted a deep piece of research, sadly for our team, on the use of community notes during the Southport riots, and found that despite this being a community-based method which has real promise, in a crisis situation, unfortunately, the vast majority of notes that were created, nearly 80% of those notes that were created by civic groups, were not published, which meant that the community-based moderation method that was being used in that environment was simply not happening. It wasn't functioning, which meant that notes that were posts that were either illegal were not being removed, but also ones that ideally needed context, and I totally agree, having more tools for context is so important. were not functioning. And so when we look at the tools that we have to regulate platforms to ensure that these methods are functioning, we've been working closely with Ofcom on the crisis protocols that they've been developing for platforms. And unfortunately, at the moment, we don't think they go anywhere near as far enough. They rely on platforms to define what a crisis is, to decide if it's a crisis. And at the moment, it's up to platforms if they activate that. So we're calling for, firstly, greater data access from platforms so that we're able to research and hold them to account. But also the ability for us to activate a crisis protocol that means that all platforms are responding and that users have visibility and understand that that's what's occurring. But if I could bring us just specifically to a particular moment that is a bit of a concern for us at the moment, is a period of an election. Because there are particular types of crises, and we've talked about Southport, which has both a crisis in an offline world, but also in an online world, an information crisis, because the volume of misinformation. Our concern is at the moment we are very vulnerable to an information crisis during an election period. And so at the moment we're calling for an amendment to the Online Safety Act that would facilitate a means by which platforms are assessing the risk and responding to issues of false information during the election phase. So a code of practice for that particular vulnerability, and that would also call for a code of practice around harassment and intimidation of candidates. Because again, it's a really nuanced and difficult area, but it's the kind of behaviour during the election period that is preventing people from becoming politicians, but is also endangering the integrity of the election. So we think a really careful, nuanced approach to a protocol that is transparent, that's ideally accountable to Parliament, is one that is negotiated outside of an election period and put through, ideally, the elections bill as that moves through Parliament in the coming months. We think that would provide a really important piece of resilience and protection in a really febrile and potentially difficult and quite threatening moment for our democracy.
Annalise, would you pick up on that in the context of what you started talking about on freedom of speech and thinking about those protests in London which were about freedom of speech and how politicised this area and polarised it is at the moment?
Yeah, of course. I think we have to be confident, actually, in this area. And what we're not talking about a lot of the time is people's ability to express themselves, to have a discussion, to talk about difficult issues, to come to an agreement about them if they can, or if not, to disagree agreeably. What we're talking about is people receiving extreme racist abuse, having their address put on the internet, people being unable actually to speak for themselves. And we've known that this is a problem for a long time. I mean, Dame Sarah Khan's review of social cohesion, there was a poll repeated in there, and I think she describes this as kind of ultimately freedom restricting harassment, including online. She showed that actually the general public are really concerned about that. It's something that people are worried about. And we might think it has an impact on politicians. It has an impact on everyone. It has an impact on people wanting to participate in a whole variety of different things. Individuals are self-censoring at the moment, and that's the reality. And I think we need to change the language, actually, for this discussion. Freedom of speech is really important, but as I said, that doesn't mean freedom to harass and to silence. I don't think that the current legislative context is ready for this. I agree with what was said about the kind of change that's needed. I was recently reading Papera, for anyone who's been an election agent, you will know this well. I was looking at the stuff for non-party political campaigners. I mean, it reads like they're talking about maybe a group protesting about a library closure or something like that, or a local environmental group, not like Russian bots who are trying to close down online debate. So we need to change the mindset, I think, around this. And I think ultimately we need to recognise the fact that we're talking about major platforms which effectively, and I'm not the first person to say this, Josh Simons has said it and I agree with him, we're talking about platforms that are almost like utilities, right? They are often monopolies. They get their power often because they're ubiquitous, because we all use them, we all benefit from them. And individual action isn't going to cut it. Some people may have seen the campaigning by Nathaniel Carroll, where she took Meta to court because she didn't want to be receiving or have her data used by Facebook. But she said, actually, I still have to use Facebook because it's the way that I connect with my friends and family. You know, she felt she didn't have a choice there. So we need to see ultimately regulation that's matching the scale of these technologies, and which actually does understand the potential impact of these things for our democracy. And I suppose I just finished by saying, often on the left, I feel, you know, we talk about democracy as if it's a kind of, I don't know, an esoteric concept, you know, a kind of dusty idea from the past. Actually, what we're talking about is whether people can make a free and a fair choice. And if they don't have access to information that really represents what's going on, they can't make a free and fair choice. And that really is what's at stake here.
Thank you so much. I wanted to pick up on Kirsty's point about citizen responsibility in this as well, but back to Shuab, because we've also got Votes at 16 coming up. Your research kind of is such an insight into what's fueling young people's approach to this. And I was lucky enough to spend a day in Sheffield with you, and we went to schools, and what I saw there was schools' nervousness about talking about these issues and not feeling confident. What do you think the potential is for schools to be kind of part of the solution, media literacy, those kind of things?
Yeah, it was interesting. In my past life, I used to work for a university, and my job was around sense of belonging and creating a sense of belonging at campus. So I'm a big fan of it. So before I start with what I'm going to say next, I want to give that context. I think one of the things that we found was that schools were scared to have conversations because they wanted a school to be quite a sterile environment, a school that is safe for every student to talk, well, not talk freely, but feel safe and not feel like anything that another student is saying is attacking them or their beliefs or whatever it may be. What we've created instead is quite a sterile environment in which young people or teachers feel like if young people go out blind, they're going to have to report them to the authorities, or young people won't feel comfortable. Yeah, young people won't feel comfortable saying what they want to say in these situations. So I think there's a story of these two young men at the back of a room in Sheffield, and this is a particularly difficult school that you joined us on, where the conversations were not flowing. They didn't care that Peter Heine was the former advisor to Tony Blair, or that I went to a fancy university. They were not interested in anything that we had to say. So we really had to prod, and I was stood there at the front really trying to prod. And there's two boys with their hoods up, and it was a technical college, with their hoods up, kind of looking at the floor. And one of them looked up mistakenly at me, and I picked on him, and I said, you know, like, please give me something. And I think that was like sorrow for me. He kind of answered the question. He said something really poetic. He said, women are born on top of the mountain and are judged on how far they fall. And men are born at the bottom of the mountain and are judged on how far they climb. And we were talking about gender, and gender more generally. And his friend checked up when I asked him to explain in more detail. And his friend checked up next to him and said, well, if a girl can't afford to live, she can just whack a picture online and make 50 quid. And I was like, do you know anyone that does that? And he goes, well, no, but that's their role model, isn't it? And I'm like, okay, cool, interesting. But the point is, at the back of the classroom, there was two assistant heads. And they looked outraged. And when we got into a conversation for 10 minutes about OnlyFans, in which the room did light up and people were giving their opinions, both for and against, whatever it may be. And these were 16 to 18-year-olds. And the two head teachers at the back looked completely mortified. And I was incredibly concerned that we just messed up in regards to safeguarding. So after Pia took over the conversation, I went to the back of the classroom and I looked at them and said, this is going so well. And she looked at me like, really? And I was like, yeah, this is the best school that we've ever had. But in her head, it was, she couldn't believe that her school, that her students had these opinions and had these thoughts. And that's a real concern if teachers in schools don't know what young people are feeling or thinking, because we have to create an environment in which they don't feel like we've created an environment in which, for SEND reasons, for the terrorism incidents that we had in the past, we've created an environment where there's very clear reporting outlining for teachers. Yeah, so that's an issue. But then there's another point of, are we supporting teachers to have the ability to have those conversations? Again, we spoke to assistant heads at the end of every conversation that we had in schools, and Peter had this one line, which was that he would repeat at every single school, was like, what's your biggest challenge at the moment, to the assistant heads or the heads? And one of the heads said, the biggest challenge is that the young teachers that are coming through are also now Gen Z. you've got 23 or 24-year-old teachers who also don't want to have these conversations or don't feel comfortable having these conversations. So you've not equipped teachers to have these conversations anymore. And the ones that were doing it in the past are too scared to have this conversation. Yeah, so yeah. I don't know if you've answered that very clearly, but yeah.
Absolutely, absolutely. Thank you very much. But open up to questions. Oh, loads of hands. I'm going to take the two at the front. I'll take them in twos. These two here, Smear first, and then we'll move back. Thank you. Do you want to introduce yourself?
Hi, my name is Mika. I'm in the Jewish Labour Movement Youth Delegation. I wanted to talk, I guess, about schools. I've just been working my gap year as an educator in the Senegal, which is quite like a big Senegal, it's like 4,000 members, like 1,000 under 18. I've been thinking a lot about like, education recently. I'm just interested what you guys think about like schools as a model, thinking less about the curriculum, the content being taught in class, and more about the structure of schools itself. So I just feel we've got such a limited vision of what education can be. And I think it's a really big issue in terms of all these things that we're talking about in the adult world. People not having trust, people not taking action in society, not having initiative, not being active citizens. We're like so worried about all of these things, but if you look at what's going on in schools, I don't really care about what the content is being taught in classes. Like in terms of the structure of school, the kids are told to sit down, be quiet, like not told, just do as they're told, and sort of prepare for exams. Like kids are not responsible or active in any way in their schools, and I think like it's not surprising that they, after 16 years of that, they go out and still go along and they're not being responsible and not being active as a condition.
That's brilliant. Can you pass the mic back?
Thank you so much. This is a fantastic panel. Thank you all. I'm Alan Rennick from the Constitution Unit at University College London. Very similar question, actually. I was struck that education hasn't really come up terribly much until just the very end of the conversation there. And I'm wondering what role you think education can play in promoting the outcomes that we're talking about, and what needs to happen in order for that education to play that role. So you talked briefly there about teacher training. There's also the curriculum. I mean, what other things concretely need to be done in order to enable education to play the role?
I'm going to actually hand it to Hannah, because in a past life, and one of the things that brought Hannah to the work she does, Hannah was a teacher.
Yes, which is why I was showing I was nodding hard to everything you said, but also to the kind of educational environment that you were describing just there. I think there has been a trend in this country, a very deliberate one actually, to shift to a mode of teaching which is very teacher-led. It's very knowledge-rich, and it's lent itself to a certain way of teaching, which does make the student more passive. I think if we're moving to a place where we very much hope that media literacy will be moved on to the curriculum in a statutory fashion, so it's something that isn't only taught in schools where students are more privileged, there's more time in the timetable, they don't have to spend as much time on assessments. We hope that with media literacy on the curriculum, there'll be a chance for more time to spend actually evaluating different kinds of texts beyond Shakespeare and Chaucer. But that really requires different teacher training. It requires more student-led projects, it requires more peer-to-peer learning, and it requires a different kind of teacher training, because as to your point, it's not the way that teachers are taught it's not the way we're trained anymore. It's a very different skill set. But if I might expand a bit further, I think we've also got other issues, for example, our impartiality standards. And it's incredibly terrifying to talk about a particular topic when you've got 30 students, and just to the point about safeguarding, but also to the kinds of criticism that you can get from parents online, which can take all manner of representations that can threaten your job as a teacher. So there are a number of different things about how we're regulated in terms of our impartiality. But just going back to relationships, I think that the role that a teacher plays often in formal lessons becomes totally different in co-curricular. And having time for extracurricular and having that supported by additional adults, not just your teacher, I think is a really important role. And I think if we're looking to other aspects of our community, other types of community infrastructure, but also thinking importantly about opportunities through broadcasting. We have the BBC Charter Review coming up, we have other opportunities to be disseminating, role modelling different kinds of behaviour. that doesn't put all the pressure on the teacher, and actually ideally might start equipping parents to have more difficult conversations or modelling different behaviours themselves. And I have to say, I don't think I model great behaviour in terms of that I use social media. I try, but sometimes you can doom scroll a bit. And I think changing behaviour is really hard. The whole society, we did it just on the curriculum, or changing the way that teachers train, but also thinking about who else can be sharing this responsibility and how else we can equip them.
Kirsty, did you want to pick up any points around kind of the role of schools in communities and governance?
Yeah, very happily. I think it's really important to see why young people should be a focus of our attention. And to my mind, it's actually because they are at school, not because they are young. So it's because there's a theatre to do this work, right? There's a modality that allows us to do the media literacy work. Because actually, if any of us think about in our own lives, the sources of misinformation in our own WhatsApp groups are not the young people in our lives. Let's be honest about it. It's Uncle John who's sharing something unsavoury, right? So I don't actually think there's much evidence that young people are more susceptible to mis and disinformation than anybody else. I think there's quite a lot of evidence that they're less susceptible. Apart from the one thing that in a lot of the work that I used to do around kind of hate and education, there was two things that I learned that's quite important to hold on to. One is if you teach children about propaganda at the wrong point in their development, they conclude, oh, nothing's real, right? So if you say, actually, as a species, we're quite susceptible to getting carried away through incendiary communications, they go, well, maybe that's already happened to me, maybe that other thing that I've heard from the government said, maybe that's propaganda. So there's an interesting research project that said basically if you teach children about propaganda, you make them more susceptible to propaganda. If you ask them to make propaganda, they understand the mechanics of how it works. So they actually become more literate by doing it, which is why I'm obsessed with this question about thoughts following behaviour, not the other way around. The second thing that I'd really commend you all is Karen Stenner, who's both a political scientist and a political psychologist. Her research talks quite a lot about attitudinal and personality predispositions, predispositions towards authoritarianism, but also predisposition towards conspiratorial thinking. And one of the things that is true about people's self-description that are conspiratorially minded is they will say two things about themselves. I am above averagely intelligent and I am above averagely motivated to and capable of conducting my own research. So people believe themselves to be ferreting out information that's hidden because they are really willing to kind of devote the time to it. Now, given we know that that exists in quite a high proportion of the population, I think the question for all of us is how do we, that impulse is good. The impulse to ferret out information is a great impulse that education should be trying to kind of fire in all of us. But it's how do we make sure that when people are ferreting information, they're getting good quality information, which goes back to the supply side challenges that Hannah was talking about. Actually, we've got quite a lot of interesting research around this already, about the interaction between polarisation, conspiracism and pedagogy, and there's quite a lot to lean on already, is my hunch.
Yeah, just really briefly, I think actually we have to bear in mind the increasing use of AI within this conversation too, and its use by everyone. And I am quite hopeful that what until now has been kind of an area where there's been a lot of activism, enthusiasm, lots of different groups of teachers and specialists and experts, psychologists working on this, that could get pulled into something that's more coherent as part of the curriculum review. But it can't just be one subject, it's got to be right across all of them if this is going to be successful. I think Votes at 16 actually, again, because that institutional element that everyone comes together is actually very, very helpful from that point of view, because that should be a time where people are able to disagree agreeably together in a way that's kind of moderated, if there is backing then for teachers actually, and that is absolutely critical because they can't be putting themselves out there and then being shot down and having all the consequences, and that has happened in the past. But just very, very briefly, just to say how difficult this can be. I mean, in my constituency, at university level, all this issue about how to kind of disagree agreeably has become incredibly politicised. We've had attempts to try and have those conversations about contentious issues. You've had journalists turning up and kind of blowing the whole thing up. I mean, this is very difficult to do. So I think the worst thing that could possibly happen is if you have teachers told they've got to be delivering this, but without being backed up, without having the right training, without actually being told, well, sometimes there might be mistakes that might be made, but you're not going to be hung out to dry and be put on the front of the Daily Mail if that happens. I think that's going to be very important.
Sure.
Yeah, very quickly. I think all the points have been covered already, but like the importance. So I worked on this project with Peter Hyman, who's a former head teacher, and his whole thing is oracy skills. So I completely agree that we need to have more oracy skills, critical thinking, debate, and conversation. But importantly, I know that this is not what's been suggested at all, but teachers need to be very careful about telling young people what to trust and what not to trust. The reason I say that is the content that they're all consuming online at the moment is telling young people that there's a matrix that exists. This matrix that the government and schools are trying to control the way that you think. So you have to bear in mind, any sort of media literacy training has to bear in mind, it has to be agile towards whatever messages are being shared with you.
Fantastic, thank you. And I would love to take more questions, but we are at time. I can't believe how much we've covered in that session. We've gone from online to offline, from technology to regulation to education. And we did quite a lot of psychology at one point as well, which I think is all really rich and relevant. This it demonstrates the work that Hannah is leading at Demos on epistemic security. We have a network that convenes around a lot of these areas individually, teasing them out, looking for the opportunities to influence and improve in every way the flow of our information supply chain. So do follow that from our website, from our newsletters, because this conversation does continue. I want to say a huge thank you to absolutely brilliant speakers, excellent questions.